Good morning. Joshua Ball with Richland Road Church of Christ, bringing you the lesson this morning, the Bible lesson for our young men, our teen group. We're studying specifically challenges faced by Christian men today. And today we're going to look at another man of the Bible who displays a great deal of humility through his ordeal, and that's Joseph. Joseph, we can learn about him in Genesis chapter 37. I won't take time to read the entire chapter to you. You can pause the video or go back and read it afterwards. But we'll start in Genesis chapter 37. If you read that whole chapter, you learn a little bit about Joseph. So if we take a look at that chapter, we start out. Joseph is a young man who wakes up one morning. He has this dream, and he goes and he tells his older brothers. He has a few older brothers. He tells his older brothers about this dream. First one is about sheaves of wheat. So if you don't know what a sheaf of wheat is, a lot of the familiar pictures we see of agriculture and finances, they show these stalks of wheat that come up. They're bound together in the center, and they have the heads of the wheat that are spread out at the top. That is a sheaf of wheat, and they used to cut them with a sickle or a long knife. They would cut the wheat, and then they would bind them together, and then they would stack them in the field so that the water would run off of them. And then when they needed the wheat, they would go out and gather these sheaves and bring them into the threshing floor, where they would beat them on the threshing floor and release the grain from the head. And then they would have the grains. And then you could use the actual stalks and the rest of it as bedding for animals. It was very labor intensive. It was before they had machinery to do this type of work. So it was something that the people there were very familiar with if you said we were gathering wheat and making sheaves of wheat. So he basically tells his brothers that we were out in the field gathering sheaves of wheat, and all of a sudden my sheaf of wheat stood up on its own, and your sheaves of wheat came and bowed down to it. And that didn't make the brothers very happy, because he was the younger brother, and they were the older brothers, and they felt that they had dominion over him, and that they were more powerful than him, and that there was no way that they were going to be subservient to him. So kind of made him angry, made him jealous. All of a sudden they kindled their fire of anger against him. So he has another dream, and this dream is about stars, and his star would be in the center, and their stars would gather around and bow. And it was very similar to the first one, and it just reinforced the idea in his brothers' minds that he thought that they were going to be subservient to him, and it just compounded their jealousy and compounded their anger against him. And it was something that they kept in the back of their mind for quite a while. They just couldn't let that go. So that's our opening chapter, discussing Joseph and what his relationship with his brothers was like. So then we fast forward for some time, and his older brothers are out tending his father's flocks, and his father had sent them off to a pasture land. He wanted to know how they were doing and how the flocks were doing, so he calls Joseph. Joseph says, "What do you need, Father?" He says, "I need you to go and check on your brothers and check on my flocks, and bring me back a report as to how they're doing." So Joseph goes out. He goes to one area where he thought they were, and a man tells him that they had moved on. He finally tracks him down in another area, and as he's coming to across the land to see his brothers see him. They kind of gather around and say, "Hey, here comes Joseph. Here's that kid that we don't like. He thinks we're all going to be subservient to him." So they decide. Originally, they wanted to kill him. They said, "We just had enough of this kid. Let's just kill him." And one of the brothers speaks up and says, "No, that's not a good idea. Let's not put our hand against him and kill him. Father really likes him. We don't want Father to be upset. So let's just put him in a pit." They found a big pit out in the wilderness, and let's put him down in this pit and leave him there. That way we at least don't kill him. So that's what they do. He comes in, they attack him, they rip his coat off of him. See, his father was very fond of Joseph. He considered him one of his favorites, and had given him this coat of many colors, basically as a prize, and said, "Hey, you're favored among your brothers. You're favored in my house." And that was another thing that had kindled their jealousy against Joseph. So they stripped him of this coat, threw him down in this pit, and was preparing to leave him there. And they sat down and was having a meal, and they were talking about it. And they noticed that there was some Ishmaelites that were coming from afar off. They were basically slave traders. This group that was coming was slave traders. So one of the brothers got it in their head. They said, "Hey, if we leave him here, we don't profit. If we kill him, we don't profit and put anything in our pockets. But if we sell him as a slave, we have some money now that we can split up among ourselves." So they get the idea in their head that they're going to sell him as a slave. So at the end of the chapter, it's a couple chapters. So we got chapter 37 where we're introduced into Joseph, and then we have chapter 39. By the end of chapter 39, they decide that they are going to. At the end of chapter 37, they're going to sell him to these slave traders. So that's what they do. 20 shekels of silver was the price. And then they take the coat that his father had given him. They slaughter a goat. They dip the coat in the blood. And they go back and tell the father, "Hey, sorry, Joseph got eaten by wild animals. He's torn to shreds. He's gone. Here's his coat." And his father's very distraught, tears his own clothing, and mourns for Joseph. So here we are, this 17-year-old boy, and he's been sold as a slave. And so he's lost his family, he's lost his father, he's lost his brother, he's lost his freedom, and he's 17 years old. So if you think about that for a moment, a lot of our young men are not much older than that. Think about how you would feel if you lost your home, lost your family, lost your freedom, and that is your future now at 17 years old. So look at your discussion questions on your worksheet. Does Joseph seem very humble to you at the beginning of this? We talk about his dreams of the sheaves of wheat and the stars, and he's telling his family members, "Hey, look, I had this dream. You're going to gather around me and bow down. You're going to be subservient to me," or at least that's how they interpret it. And notice he doesn't give them that interpretation. He simply tells them what the dream is. They come to that conclusion on their own. So I have to ask, when you start reading this chapter and you start thinking about this 17-year-old boy who's giving these dreams, telling these dreams to his family, do you think that it's easier for young people today to be more arrogant? And why do you think that? Talk about that amongst yourselves, amongst your family members. Why do you think that young people it's easier for them to be more arrogant? Why do you think Joseph's brothers did to him what they did? Now, personally, I think that their arrogance and their jealousy was kindled against him. But why do you think that is? And how do you think Joseph was feeling at the end of this chapter, considering all the things that he lost, his family and his freedom? But at the end of this chapter, we have to remember that that the Lord was with Joseph. So you got to remember that Joseph had a relationship with God, and when we say that he had a relationship with Him, just like the relationship you have with anyone, you have to build that relationship over time. You have to have discussions with that person. You have to get to know that person. And if Joseph had a relationship with God, if God was with him, I have to imagine that all throughout this, he's praying to God, he's talking to God, he knows Scripture because he's taken time to build that relationship with him. So let's find out what happens to Joseph based on that relationship that he has with God. If we fast forward to chapter 39, we can see what happens to Joseph. So he's sold to these slave traders. Slave traders, in turn, take him to Egypt, and they sell him to a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar is the second in command in Egypt. He is captain of the guard of Pharaoh, the ultimate ruler in Egypt. So Potiphar is very high up the command structure in Egypt, and he sells him to Potiphar to basically be a house slave. Potiphar notices that everything that he's asked Joseph to do, everything Joseph touches, everything that he has control over, flourishes. All of a sudden just takes off and does really, really well. And he notices that's because, or he believes that's because God is with Joseph, and God is blessing everything Joseph does. So Potiphar says, hey, this guy here has found favor in the Lord's sight, and everything that he does flourishes or does really well. So I'm going to put him in charge of everything of my house. I'm basically going to put him in charge, put it on autopilot. I'm going to put it in Joseph's hands, which basically means I'm going to put it in God's hands, and I'm not going to worry about anything. And all of a sudden, everything in Potiphar's house is doing really, really well. And that's where we find him here. So, in your discussion questions, who bought Joseph from his captors? That would be Potiphar. And then if you look in chapter 39, verse 2, here's the key verse. The Lord was with Joseph. Everything that he did was blessed. And the reason that the Lord was with Joseph is he had a relationship with God. He talked to him daily. Everything that he did, he prayed about. He sought the Lord's advice. So that that relationship that he built with the Lord manifested itself, and people could see that everything that he did, he had a relationship with God. And because of that, his master, the person who bought him as a slave, found favor in his eyes, right? So he began to respect Joseph. He wasn't just the slave who works in the house. Now all of a sudden, Potiphar is starting to respect Joseph as a man of God. So he puts him in charge of many things. He starts to lift his stature. But it's not, to Potiphar's credit, the person who is lifting Joseph's stature out of being a slave was God. God was lifting Joseph up. So Potiphar puts him in charge of his entire house. Says, hey, I want you to run my house. I want you to run everything that I have control over. I'm putting you in control of. And so now Joseph has gone from what seems to be the lowest point in his entire life. You know, a young man who's had his family stripped away, had his freedom stripped away. He's being sold as a slave. His outlook looks grim, but he continues to have a relationship with God. He continues to pray, and he continues to maintain his integrity with his relationship with God. And now, what seems to be overnight in the story, but a couple of years have passed, now he's in charge of the house of the second in command of the entire nation of Egypt. The Lord has lifted him up. So, what seems to be overnight, he goes from his lowest point to now he has great wealth, and all of a sudden he's starting to become a little famous. He's no longer a common prisoner. This has taken a little bit of time, but all of a sudden things have changed for Joseph. Now, let's go a little further in Genesis chapter 39. Let's go down to verse 20. Um, Potiphar is out doing captain of the guards things or whatever he's doing. He's not there, and Joseph is running his household. And all of a sudden, somebody else turns their eye towards Joseph, and that is Potiphar's wife. She notices that this young man seems to, well, first of all, he's handsome, and he's strong, and she notices him, and she starts to become attracted to him, and she says that she basically wants to have an affair with him while her husband is away. And she makes this attempt a couple of times, and Joseph says to her, continues to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And one of the most profound things that Joseph says is in chapter 39, verse 39. He basically says, how can I do this thing that you ask and sin against God? He's not so much concerned about his sin against Potiphar because it would be betraying Potiphar's trust. He's not so much concerned about the fact that it's simply wrong to have an affair with this young woman. He's most concerned about the thing that weighs most heavily on him is how can I sin against God? And I have to imagine that he's concerned about that because he doesn't want to break that trust and that relationship that he's worked so hard to build with the Lord. He considers his relationship with the Lord his top priority. So, despite all of his position that he's been given, he does not succumb to the sin, the pressure of Potiphar's wife, who is trying to have an affair with him. Now, if you've read this story before, you know what happens. She decides that to get back at him for rejecting her, because you remember she's wife of the second most powerful person in Egypt, so she kind of thinks pretty highly of herself as well. And I have to imagine she's a little offended by being turned down by this common slave that has been hired to work in her house. So to get back at him, one day he's in the house doing work, and she reaches out and grabs a hold of his coat, and once more says, "Hey, let's have an affair." He says, "No way." He says, "I'm out of here," and he literally runs away from this situation. He sheds his coat, takes it off, says, "Nope, I don't even want the coat. I'm out of here." He literally runs away from this situation of sin that is attempting to ensnare him, and he leaves his coat in her hand. He's not concerned about the coat. He wants away from this situation. So she tells a lie. She tells the servants, say, "Hey, look, this Hebrew slave that was brought into our house tried to come in and have an affair with me, and I screamed, and he ran away and left his coat." And Potiphar comes back to the house. She tells him the same story. "This Hebrew slave that you brought here, put him in charge of everything, tried to have an affair with me while you were gone, and I screamed, and he ran away, and he left his coat." She holds up the coat and shows it to him as proof of her version of the story. So Potiphar becomes angry. I'm really surprised as I read this because a lot of times in this culture and in this time, if you did something wrong to that level, it usually meant execution, right? It meant end of your life. They'd put you to death. But in this case, Potiphar put Joseph in prison, in the king's prison, which kind of sounds like maybe it was a little higher level prison that kind of took care of you a little better. Regardless, they put him in prison. So now we find Joseph once again at what I would consider a lower point in his life. He's now in prison. So at the end of chapter 39, He's gone from, if we look at it, he's gone from a 17-year-old boy who's had his family stripped away. He's being sold as a slave. Now all of a sudden he's been raised up. He's in charge of the second command of the entire nation of Egypt. And now he finds himself in prison. So he's had some ups and downs in his life, just like most of us have. But the Lord was with Joseph. Again, that is made apparent throughout this entire account of Joseph's life. And the Lord was with him because of his relationship with him. Let's not forget that he continues to have a relationship with God. And what that relationship looks like is conversation, is prayer, is following the Lord's commands. So, again, now we find him in chapter 39, he's in prison. But because the Lord was with him, and because everything he did, everything he touched, all the people he talked to, all seemed to be blessed by Joseph. But it wasn't just by Joseph, it was because of the Lord. So the guard of the prison, the person in charge of prison, notices Joseph. So here he is again in a bad situation that is becoming better because of his relationship with God. So the people around him take a look at Joseph and they see blessings surround him because of his relationship with God. And that integrity, those blessings, caught the eye of those in charge of him in the prison, and they start putting him in charge of things in the prison. And as he's starting to run things in the prison, his position again starts to become elevated. So, in prison, he meets a couple of new guys. He meets the baker, the Pharaoh's baker, and the Pharaoh's cupbearer. How they became prisoners in the king's prison, I'm not sure. Somehow they fell out of favor with Pharaoh. Pharaoh threw them into the king's prison, and he meets these folks. And the cupbearer and the baker have these dreams. And this is in chapter 40. They have these dreams. Now, they can't figure out what the problem is, and Joseph is talking to them one day, and they're very distraught because they don't understand their dreams. And Joseph says, interpretation of dreams is for the Lord. Now, whether he tells them about his relationship with the Lord or not, they know just out of the talk around the prison that everybody knows that the Lord is with Joseph. They know that he has a special relationship with God, so they tell him about their dreams. Joseph correctly interprets their dreams, and it actually doesn't turn out very well for the baker. His interpretation is that says, hey, in 3 days' time, you're going to be hanged. He tells the cupbearer that you're going to be restored, and lo and behold, that's what happens. And of course, the cupbearer is restored and is back in the king's service. So now Joseph has this reputation of not only being the servant of the Lord and having a relationship with God, but now he's also has this reputation of being able to interpret dreams. So now we fast forward into chapter 41. And if you look at your study guide, there's a few questions here about how you would feel through the highs and lows of Joseph's life. Now, if we fast forward into chapter 41, what happens is Joseph, having that reputation of interpreting dreams, is still languishing away in the king's prison. But he's still continuing to do the things he's asked to do. He's running the prison. He's continuing to have his relationship with God. Meanwhile, Pharaoh has a dream, right? And he's distraught because it's a very odd dream. It has to do with 7 cows that are fat and plump and 7 skinny cows. He just doesn't understand it. He's distraught. He calls everybody in his kingdom, said, hey, I've got these dreams, or I've had this dream, and I need help interpreting it. And nobody can interpret it. And then the cupbearer comes in and says, hey, while I remember the time that I was in prison, I met this man named Joseph, and the Lord is with him, and the Lord interprets dreams through Joseph. And you should call on Joseph. He can help you. So the king calls, I kind of imagine him picking up the phone saying, hey, send me Joseph, and they're like, oh, we got to find Joseph. He's in the prison. Let's get him out. So they get him out of prison. They clean him up. The text says that he's shaven. You imagine he's all scraggly and, looks rough from being in prison. They clean him up, put him in nice clothes, shave him, probably give him a bath, and they send him in to see Pharaoh, the high ruler of Egypt. And Pharaoh says, hey, I've had these dreams. I need you, since you have favor with the Lord, I need you to interpret these dreams for me. And Joseph takes time and explains to the king, or to Pharaoh, what these dreams are. Now, when he tells him about these dreams, he's warning him. He says, your land is going to have 7 years of like a bumper crop, 7 years of great harvests in the kingdom, and you're going to have all this extra food, but you are going to then have 7 years of famine that is going to destroy the land and destroy the people. And the Lord is warning you that this is what's going to happen. So Joseph says you need to find a guy that you trust, a guy that is wise and can take control of the country's finances and take this extra food and devise a plan to store it so that it can be redistributed during the times of famine so that your land won't suffer. And the Pharaoh thinks about this for a moment, and he thinks, wow, this is a good idea. That your interpretation makes sense. I need to find this wise man. Excuse me. So after some consideration, he thinks, wow, well, Joseph seems to be wise. The Lord is with him. Everybody tells him everything he touches is blessed by the Lord. I want that favor on my land. I'm going to put Joseph in charge of this. So, wow. Now Joseph, from the lowest point in his life to the highest point in his life, being in charge of the second in command in all of Egypt, back to a low point, he's in prison. The Lord is with him through the whole thing. Now he's in charge and running the prison. He's got a little better life there. Now all of a sudden he's been brought out of prison. He goes before the high ruler of Egypt, and he finds favor with the high ruler of Egypt, and so Pharaoh puts him in charge of everything. To the point was, if you look at your study guide, the very first question about Genesis chapter 41 says, what does Pharaoh say will not happen without Joseph's consent? What he says is, no one should raise his hand or foot without Joseph's consent. Wow. He then goes further and he says, I am Pharaoh. But beyond that, you're in charge of Egypt. You're in charge of the country. You are ruling everything. He puts him in fine linens. He gives him his daughter to marry. He basically makes him Pharaoh, makes him in charge of everything. How amazing is Joseph's life now? I mean, he's powerful, he's wealthy, everything. He basically has to say it, and people will do it. And it doesn't say that he got a big swollen head and decided he was going to do all these awesome things that he wanted to do. He set himself to doing what the Lord wanted him to do. The Lord put him in charge of Egypt now, not Pharaoh. It is through his relationship with the Lord, his continuing to have that relationship where he's building that relationship through prayer, he's building that relationship through his actions and following the Lord's commands. And now the Lord has lifted him up and used Pharaoh to continue to bless Joseph and to lift him up. And if you look at your study guide, the next question I have in there is, if in 30 days, let's just take 30 days, a month, you went from being in prison, in a dungeon cell, to being in charge of an entire country, how would that change your thinking? How would that change your thoughts and your attitude, how you carried yourself? Also consider, how would that change your relationship with God? You know, when you're in prison and things have a bleak outlook and you think, this is my life, I've got these chains on my wrists, and I can only eat what they tell me to, I can only do what they tell me to. How does that change your relationship with God? How does that change how you act? How does that change your prayer life? How does that change your relationship with other people? And then all of a sudden, if you were lifted up and put in charge of an entire country, how would that change your relationship with God? How would that change your discussions with Him, your prayer life, your attitude with other people? I know I struggle with how I treat other people and how my relationship with God, my discussions with Him, and the directions those discussions go to, based on my circumstances. And I know that we shouldn't allow that to happen, that we should always faithfully serve Him and faithfully set about doing His work. But it's difficult with my human nature of sin to not allow that to affect my relationship in my prayer life, my relationship with God in my prayer life. So that's a struggle that not only young Christian men have today, but I would think that the young ladies would have to struggle with that as well. Joseph seemed to be able to control that, seemed to be able to have humility. No matter what his situation was, he would always put God as his number one priority, his relationship